Okay, so evidence of evolution. So evidence of common ancestry among species is from many different sources. We're gonna go through some of those today, especially what Darwin found in his discovery in the Galapagos Islands. So you can see right here, Darwin's finches, we talked about this last time we had class, that he noticed there's different beaks on different islands. They were all the same species, they were all finches, but they had very different beak shapes and sizes. And his explanation for that is that they were on different islands, different food sources were available. So the ones that lived were the ones who were able to eat the food, and the ones who died off couldn't eat the food available. So some of these birds could only eat insects. I can't move my pointer. I was going to show it to you with my mouse, but I guess I'll have to look at it later. But it's not very clear what they're saying on there. But you can see at the very top left one can eat leaves. The one below can eat insects. Some can eat birds, or sorry, not birds, fruit. And so it just depends on the size of the beak and the shape of the beak and what they could eat. And the ones who couldn't eat what was available on the island just died off, and the ones who could survived and passed on that trait to other offspring. So there's 4 different things we're going to look at today about what points to how animals have changed over time. And what Darwin looked at was common ancestry. What his idea was is that a lot of the animals came from one source. You know, there was one animal that then, over time, as you looked at the generations, developed into many different kinds of species. And one evidence for that was common traits among very different animals. You can see on here, it shows a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat. And while these do very different things, you know, a human's hand grasps things, a cat has a paw, a whale has a fin, and a bat has a wing. These all do very different functions. They all have similar bone structure. So you can see on here, they all have an orange bone. That's your forearm bone. You all have a wrist area. You see the yellow part below the orange bone. So a human, a cat, a whale, and even a bat, you can see has these 8 or so yellow bones at like the wrist, so you can twist around. And then below that, there are finger-like bones. So humans, we actually do have fingers. You know, cats have more of a paw-like shape. Whales and bats, they either have a wing or a fin. But in every case, we can see similar bone structures. And so because of that, Darwin said, well, they all came from one ancestor. There was one animal that had this bone structure and the genes, and passed it on to other animals, which over time evolved into whales and cats and bats. So that's one interpretation of what we're seeing here. There's other interpretations too. We could just say, well, a designer, God, made these animals in a similar way. He found something that worked really well, and he went with it. And so that's another interpretation too from this. So this evidence is not pointing to just one conclusion. There are other conclusions you can make too, but that's what Darwin concluded, is that these all came from one set of genes, which then evolved over time to other animals. Fossils, you can see on here, trilobites. They're a very common prehistoric fossil. They're about 200 million years old or so. They're kind of like roly-polies, but a lot bigger. So evidence for evolution in Darwin's time came from 4 different sources. The first one is fossils. Fossils can provide some evidence of evolution, but it's not great evidence for evolution. Darwin even said at the time that there wasn't much he could see in the way of evidence in the fossil record. He was hoping to find missing links or intermediate links, fossils that show transitions between different animal species. You know, for example, if he believed that a monkey turned into a man, that he believed he would find these intermediate links that were between humans and monkeys. But he didn't find those. And there really are not very many fossils that show a transition between various species. So, you know, there are some fossils that seem to be intermediates. There's this bird dinosaur type fossil that looks in between a bird and a dinosaur. But there's really not more than a handful of evidence that we can see these great changes in animal species. What we see more often in the fossil record is slow, gradual changes and not dramatic changes. And so Darwin was very honest about that. And he said, I don't have evidence in the fossil record for my idea. But he had faith over time that there would be evidence. But about 200 years later, we still have not found much more evidence in the way of fossils. So while the book says there's evidence for evolution in the fossil record, there really isn't a whole lot. There's better evidence for other things besides the fossil record, but that's the first one the book says. So what they did discover, though, is that fossils in older layers are more primitive than ones in upper layers. So if you want to find the oldest fossils, you go to the lowest layer, and they would build up from there. So as long as there wasn't an earthquake or a volcano, what you would see is the oldest fossils at the very bottom and layers going up to the newest fossil on top. So if you want to see how animals changed over time, you could then see throughout the layers how the animals might have changed based on the fossils you see. So trilobites are extinct, but we can see roly-polies, which are very similar to those today. And on the right-hand side, there's a lot of strange fish, sea animals at the time that had tails and antennae that are now extinct as well. But they believe these are transitions between different, between fish and amphibians, between fish and reptiles. So that was the first evidence of evolution that Darwin looked at. The next evidence is geography. And so he believed that studying geography would help provide evidence of evolution. And the islands that he looked at, the Galapagos Islands, showed that to be true. So in every island, he saw different kinds of birds. They had different beaks, and that was based on the food they ate. Sorry. Here we go. So this is clear evidence of evolution because he could see based on geography that the birds were different. They had changed over time. They had come from one place. They had come from South America and had been blown over. Either their eggs had been blown over or the birds had been blown over in the storm to the islands. And from there, they then changed based on the island they were on. So this slide still has that first bullet point from the last slide. Just doesn't have the picture right now. So he realized that the birds on islands did resemble the nearest ones on the mainland. That they were very close to the finches that he found in South America. They just had different beak shapes. So based on that, he did have confidence that they had been blown over in a storm or taken in a ship to the island and didn't just arise there on their own. Because scientists at the time, many of them said that if they were found in a place, that God had placed them there and they had just stayed there. There wasn't really much belief in that animals changing or moving around. But Darwin said, no, these birds were flown there, they were pushed there, they were placed there by a ship or a storm. And they didn't get there through a miracle, they got there through a natural way. And so that was a new way of thinking. This is a third bullet point on here. And so he also noticed that from island to island, they did show variation. So while they were all the same kind of bird, they were all finches, they definitely looked different from island to island. And that was due to the food that they found on the islands. Okay, biogeography is a study of the distribution of animals around the world, or living things around the world, not just animals. Oh, sorry. I just lost them and go back to it. There we go. Oh. Every time I get there, I just go too far. There we go. Sorry about that. And so Darwin, looking at biogeography, looking at animals on different places, that made him really convinced that animals did change over time. Based on their location, he could see very different features on them. The third evidence of evolution is embryology. Embryology is a study of how small animals or immature animals grow up to adult animals, and how they can be similar to different species and different. For example, on here you can see a larva, which is an immature form of many animals, can turn into a crab or a barnacle. So they're very different animals, but the larva looks very similar. You can't really distinguish between a crab larva and a barnacle larva. They have the same body shape, but they do turn into very different animals. And so studying how these immature animals look and how they develop into adults is embryology. Sorry, let me go back for a second. I don't know why it just does that, but here we go. So barnacles are more like snails. They just stay in place. They don't really move a whole lot. They're the things you see on whales. And if ever you notice that whales have all these bumps on them, barnacles are what make those bumps. They just attach the whale and just ride them throughout the ocean. So they're snail-like. They really don't have much mobility. Crabs in their hand, as you know, are a lot more mobile. So Darwin wondered, how could you start from the same larva but have very different results in very different animals? And his thought was that they came from one ancestor, that there is a one time, just one larva that gave rise to crabs and barnacles. And he said that pointed to evolution. So embryology is evidence of evolution as far as Darwin was concerned, because identical larvae would turn into very different body forms. If they're the same larva, if they have the same body shape to begin with, then they must have the same DNA, he thought. Same DNA means the same parent gave that to the animals and then passed on, which over time they could then change into crabs and barnacles and so on. So that's for larvae. So that'd be things like insects, crabs, but it also would be for embryos. And embryos would be reptiles, amphibians, humans, who are very, very small and developing, just weeks old. And so what evolutionists noticed is that whether you have a fish, reptile, bird, or human embryo, they do have some basic features that are the same. So this picture right here shows that you can see gill slits on all these embryos, whether it's a fish, reptile, bird, or human. There are 6 gill slits for each of them. And those gill slits over time will develop into the neck, the head, the lungs, and so on. Now, if it's a fish, some will remain and stay as gills. But for humans and birds, they'll all turn into the throat, the lungs, and so on. So what evolutionists thought is that if these all look the same, then they must have one ancestor that they got the DNA from. The fourth evidence of evolution is anatomy. And what he notices that there are many body structures that look very similar. You can see on here, the human hand, the mole foot, the bat wing, all have similar bone structures, as I pointed out before, but they do very different things. So Darwin concluded from that. Sorry, let me go back for a second to that. There we go. Sorry about that. What Darwin said is, again, that if you have these same structures in different animals, that points to them all having one ancestor that gave that trait to all these different animals. So these are called homologous structures, where they have a similar structure, but a different function. So if you're looking at, a human hand versus a mole foot or a bat wing, the bones are similarly shaped. You can see that there's the red forearm bone. You have the yellow palm part. You have the green and the red finger part on the hand of the human. And the moles and the bats also have a similar structure. But, wings are used to fly, a human's hand is used to grasp, so they have very different functions. So homologous structures are that way, where they have a similar structure but different functions. And what Darwin thought is that homologous structures are evidence of a common ancestor, that if they all have the same kind of blueprint, the same kind of basic design, that came from the DNA, and the DNA is passed on from the parents to the offspring. Analogous structures are just the inverse. So homologous structures have similar structures but different functions. For this one, analogous structures have similar functions, but different structures in a different origin. So you can see on here, these are both wings. You have a fly wing and a bat wing. Even though they are similar structures, they're both wings, they're made very differently. A fly wing doesn't have any bones in it, while a bat wing does. A bat wing has muscles and skin. A fly wing just has very thin membrane through it. So while they have the same function to fly, they have very different structures. And if they have different structures, they have different origins. They came from different parents. Because a parent passes on DNA to their child, that DNA then shapes the body of the child. But because these are so different, they have very different DNA. They had different ancestors, according to Darwin. So Darwin said that this would not be evidence of evolution, because if they have different structures, they came from different parents. And Darwin was trying to find a way to have every animal come from one ancestor. His idea is that every living thing came from an original cell, which then gave rise to different kinds of plants and animals and so on. So if you see very different structures, those are very different DNAs that came from different parents. So we can look at how structures of animals change over time, and that might give evidence of how evolution may have occurred through the animal population. Vestigial structures are remnants of organs or structures that had a function in an early ancestor. So an ostrich, for example, might have flown at one time. They might have had much bigger wings that let them fly. But over time, they became very fast runners. They're the fastest land birds in the world. They can go about 45 miles per hour. And so because they have such strong legs, they can run so fast, the wings slowed them down. So over time, the wings got smaller and smaller to let them run faster. So it's possible that these wings are vestigial structures, which means that they're not useful to the animal anymore, but they were at one time. And that's evidence that animals over time can adapt and change their environment. No, sorry, did you get the one? Let me go back for a second just to make sure. Yeah. And these are amazing birds. They can get about 9 feet tall and about 400 pounds big. So these can grow incredibly large. They can be very strong creatures. They can run very fast. And because they're so big, they just aren't able to fly anymore. But they're very good on the land. They can run very fast, so the wings slow them down. And one of their eggs is equal to about 12 eggs. So one of their eggs equals 12 chicken eggs in size. For humans, wisdom teeth might be vestigial. At one time, we might have needed our wisdom teeth. So when humans were eating harder things like, seeds and nuts and things that were very hard to crack open, they might have needed that extra molar in the back. So if you grow up eating hard things, you're going to get a larger jaw. The more you use the bones in your body, the bigger they get. So if you use the bones in your jaw, you're going to make them larger. And so if kids grew up eating really hard things, then their jaw would get bigger. But nowadays, things in our diet are much softer and our jaws don't get as big. And wisdom teeth don't always have room to grow in. As you can see on here, the third molar is the wisdom tooth and it's kind of getting crowded in. The second molar is a 12-year molar. And those ones come in just fine for everybody, but the wisdom tooth, the third molar, doesn't always, because again, over time we've adapted to having a smaller jaw. And so that could be because our diet's changed, also because maybe our brain's gotten bigger. And with our brain getting bigger, our jaw has to get smaller as a trade-off. So there are two reasons why wisdom teeth over time are not needed anymore. So that's vestigial, where at one time we needed it, but nowadays we don't need it. Another example could be the appendix. Do y'all see it on there? It's the very bottom. If you follow the large intestine on the left-hand side. So the appendix is a very small structure at the end of your large intestine. And it holds good bacteria. Now, we just realized that a few years back. For a long time, we didn't know what it did. We thought it might have been used in previous humans, but not in modern day humans. But what we realized is that it does have a purpose. It's to hold good bacteria in the intestine. If you have a sickness, then your body will wash out the large intestine and will flush out all the good bacteria, which is very important for your body. Good bacteria makes vitamin K, which is important for blood clotting. Good bacteria promotes good health. It kills bad bacteria. So without good bacteria or probiotics, you would be in bad health. So the good bacteria can hide in the appendix if you have an illness that makes your body flush out the intestine and then come back and repopulate the intestine over time. So that's probably why we have the appendix. We're not sure, but that's one thought that we have. So it was thought to be vestigial, where one time it had a use, but now it doesn't. But scientists are thinking, no, it still has a use, it's still important. You can live without it, but it would just, if you have a sickness, stomach virus, you'll take longer to recover from it without the appendix. But with antibiotics, you'll be fine. That picture right there shows you where wisdom tooth should come in. The blue arrow points to that. You can see on the right-hand side, it did come in. Left-hand side, it hasn't yet. There's probably not room for it on the left-hand side, but that gives you an idea of what it would look like. And you usually get it from about age 16 to 20 or so is when they come in. So some people even today still can get wisdom teeth come in and just fine and just stay in place. Others get them removed. It just depends. But most of the time, we don't have space for them. Okay, that concludes the slideshow. Let me go ahead and